It's not the fact that a white man and a black woman got married. It's the fact that she said, we wanted to get married, but the law wouldn't let us get married in Virginia.
As the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments sought to ensure equality for all, African Americans were optimistic for a better future. However, racial discrimination against African Americans persisted as new state laws quickly emerged to enforce the segregation between races, including anti-miscegenation laws that were upheld in 16 states, banning interracial marriages. Mildred and Richard Loving, a couple residing in Virginia, were subsequently forced to leave the state because their marriage consisted of a white man and colored woman. After a 9-year-long legal battle known as Loving v. Virginia, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled to ban all state laws prohibiting interracial marriages. Ultimately, Loving v. Virginia is considered to be one of the most significant legal decisions during the civil rights movement, breaking racial barriers for millions of Americans and serving as a catalyst in diminishing the prejudice against African Americans. Today, this landmark decision continues to protect countless interracial marriages and has paved the way for racial equality.
Following the victory of the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed in an effort to offer equal protection for all citizens under the law, regardless of race. In response, many southern states began passing new laws to strip African Americans of their newly given constitutional rights through racial segregation, which was ultimately supported by the U.S. Supreme Court under the Separate but Equal Clause. Regarding marriages between black and white individuals, amendments against miscegenation or interracial marriages were proposed to the U.S. Congress several times but were all rejected. However, 16 states passed their own state laws forbidding miscegenation, such as the Racial Integrity Act passed by Virginia in 1924.
The laws are simply relics of slavery, and they're maintained to keep the colored person down and the white person up, and that's the simple truth of the case.
Consequently, after witnessing numerous legal barriers that threatened their constitutional rights, African Americans began participating in protests in an attempt to end racial discrimination, which ultimately gave way to the civil rights movement.
In 1950, Mildred Dolores Jeter, who was of African American and Native American descent, and Richard Perry Loving, who was of English and Irish descent, met in Caroline County, Virginia as adolescents. Their friendship soon evolved into a romantic relationship, and after Jeter became pregnant in 1958, Loving proposed and the two were engaged. With interracial marriage being outlawed in Virginia, the couple legally wed in Washington, D.C. on June 2, 1958. The Lovings then returned back to their hometown in Virginia with their marriage certificate to live together in the Jeter residence, with the belief that the state would tolerate interracial marriages legally performed elsewhere. However, when an anonymous tip notified county authorities of the Lovings' marriage, the local court authorized their arrest on counts of miscegenation and were both detained in the county jail.
It was about 2 a.m. and I saw this light, and I woke up and it was the policeman standing beside the bed, and he told us to get up, that we was under arrest.
The following day, while Richard Loving was released on bail, his wife Mildred Loving had to remain for several more days before being granted bail. In October, a state grand jury indicted the Lovings for miscegenation, and the couple pleaded guilty in January of the following year. Trial Judge Leon M. Bazile offered the Lovings two options: face 1 year in prison or leave the state for 25 years and return separately. Refusing to break up their marriage, the couple subsequently left Virginia and relocated to Washington, D.C., where they raised their 3 children, Cindy, Donald, and Peggy Loving.
The white and colored went to school different, and I knew that, but I didn't realize how bad it was until we got married.
Desperate to be back with her family in Virginia, Mildred Loving wrote a letter asking for legal assistance to U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, who then referred the Lovings to the American Civil Liberties Union, or the ACLU, who agreed to take their case.
Please help us if you can. Hope to hear from you real soon. Yours truly, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Loving. And it was that simple letter that got us into this not-so-simple case.
In November of 1963, the legal battle began. Two ACLU lawyers, Bernard Cohen and Philip Hirschkopf, unsuccessfully convinced Judge Bazile to overturn his original verdict. After this loss, the lawyers took the case to the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals, who also upheld the original ruling. In an attempt to salvage the case, Cohen and Hirschkopf brought the case into the attention of the U.S. Supreme Court in 1967. Because of the recent passing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which outlawed racial discrimination, the U.S. Supreme Court accepted and investigated the case. The legal battle endured between attorney Robert D. McIlwain, who defended the constitutionality of Virginia's Racial Integrity Act, and Cohen and Hirschkopf, who argued that the anti-miscegenation law violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution.
No one can articulate it better than Richard Loving when he said to me, "Mr. Cohen, tell the court I love my wife, and it is just unfair that I can't live with her in Virginia."
On June 12, 1967, the Supreme Court justices announced their final verdict. In a unanimous decision, they deemed Virginia's anti-miscegenation law unconstitutional. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote, "Under our Constitution, the freedom to marry or not marry a person of another race resides with the individual and cannot be infringed by the state." Ultimately, this landmark decision overturned the original verdict of the case and even struck down laws prohibiting interracial marriage in every U.S. state. After a grueling and intensive 9 years of legal battles, the Lovings were finally victorious.
A critical turning point in the civil rights movement, Loving v. Virginia served as a step closer to ending the racial discrimination against African Americans. However, the public response was mixed. While white supremacists were enraged by the final verdict and actively participated in protests against the decision, other Americans were thrilled about the case and its potential as a stepping stone for equality. In 1975, Richard Loving passed away due to a car crash. Mildred Loving continued living in Caroline County, Virginia, until she passed away in 2008, having never remarried. The two are now buried next to each other in their hometown.
This milestone decision has evidently left a lasting impact on Americans. Between 1970 and 1992, interracial marriages increased by 378%.
I know in this situation with interracial marriages, I'm very proud of the fact that my grandparents has opened a door for other individuals that may have been going through the same thing, or maybe hadn't gotten to that point, but now they don't have to go through that challenge. They're able to just go ahead and marry.
Although certain states were initially reluctant to accept the Loving versus Virginia ruling, by 2000, all states had removed their anti-miscegenation law, finally allowing for the free marriage among races. Furthermore, in 2015, the Supreme Court expanded marriage rights to same-sex couples and legalized same-sex marriages nationwide in Obergefell versus Hodges, referring back to the Loving versus Virginia ruling. In addition, this case inspired the award-winning movie Loving, which focused on the Lovings' fight to overcome the racial barriers that prohibited their marriage. Loving versus Virginia symbolized one of the greatest legal battles of the civil rights movement, pegging Mildred and Richard Loving as heroes of their time who contributed to the concluding end of the fight for equality.
And it actually helped start a lot of movements towards full equality for everybody.
Loving v. Virginia has undoubtedly left an incredible legacy to this day. In recognition of the landmark case, June 12th, which was when the Supreme Court announced their ruling for Loving v. Virginia, is now commemorated as Loving Day, a holiday that celebrates interracial families that are now able to exist due to the historic journey Richard and Mildred Loving endured to overcome and break countless racial barriers.